The first issue that needs to be clarified is the actual strength and solidity of the Twin Towers, since both the 9/11 Commission and the debunkers have made extensive efforts to depict them as extremely light and fragile buildings.
The outside of each tower was covered by a frame of 14-inch wide steel columns. The centers of the steel columns were 40 inches apart. These exterior walls bore the majority of the weight of the building. The interior core of the buildings was a hollow steel shaft in which elevators and stairwells were grouped.
Le torri di New York invece erano sostenute da un'intelaiatura esterna, da sottili nervature d'acciaio, insomma erano come dei parallelepipedi vuoti.
Il World Trade Center era una struttura leggerissima, era la massima espressione del grattacielo leggero, come lo chiamano i tecnici. C'è un solo altro edificio che io sappia, che è quella che si chiamava un tempo la Sears Tower a Chicago, che usa lo stesso tipo di struttura. Dopo il World Trade Center nessuno l'ha più usata.
As we shall see, all these statements are false. Contrary to traditional skyscrapers, where all the support columns are equally spaced, in the Twin Towers, part of the supporting columns had been moved towards the exterior wall, creating a large column-free space available for rental. For this reason, the external structure had literally become a grid of steel columns made with prefabricated blocks that were mounted on site. These are the thin steel nerves mentioned by debunker Alberto Angela, 244 steel columns placed approximately 2 feet apart, which supported 40% of the weight of the towers. Far from being two empty parallelepipeds, the internal structure was comprised of 47 steel columns, so long and sturdy that a special factory in Japan had to be built in order to assemble them. It was the core structure to support the majority of the weight of the building, 60% of it, and not the external structure. The core structure seen on the left is what the 9/11 Commission has called a hollow steel shaft. This is the same core structure near the base of the tower. The core structure was an actual, extremely robust steel skyscraper built within another skyscraper. The core structure housed the stairs, the elevators, and all other services needed for the functioning of the tower. The inner walls of the core structure were made of simple layers of sheetrock. A long series of steel trusses connected the core structure to the external one and supported the floors. The floors were also prefabricated rectangular pieces covered by a thin layer of concrete. The internal and external structure connected through an umbrella-like structure called a hat truss, which kept together the towers and bound them from above. The idea that this kind of structure is fragile and therefore no longer used after 9/11 is disproven by the new Building 7 built by Larry Silverstein. A strong central structure supports the majority of the weight of the building. Long steel beams support the floors and connect the core structure to the external one, allowing for a large column-free space in between. A very similar concept to the one used in the Twin Towers. Most importantly, the debunkers forget to mention that the Twin Towers were built with a structural redundancy of 3 to 5 times the weight they were meant to support.
This structure was capable of holding 3 to 5 times the weight.
These buildings are built to handle several times the load above them. So those perimeter columns could handle 5 times the load above them, and the core columns could handle 3 times the load above them.
In addressing the solidity of the Twin Towers, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology stated that its 244 perimeter columns made it one of the most redundant and one of the most resilient skyscrapers. On the same subject, the architectural firm of Roth & Sons wrote, "The building as designed is 16 times stiffer than a conventional structure. The Virendeel trusses would be so effective, according to the engineer's calculations, that all the columns on one side of a tower could be cut, as well as the 2 corners and several columns on the adjacent sides, and the tower would still be strong enough to withstand a 100-mile-per-hour wind." John Skilling, the structural engineer who designed the Twin Towers, stated, "Live loads on these perimeter columns can be increased more than 2,000% before failure occurs." In particular, the Twin Towers were designed to sustain the impact of a large airliner traveling at 600 miles per hour and still remain standing. Interviewed in 1993 by the Seattle Times, John Skilling stated, "We looked at every possible thing we could think of that could happen to the buildings, even to the extent of an airplane hitting the side. Our analysis indicated the biggest problem would be the fact that all the fuel from the airplane would dump into the building. There would be a horrendous fire, a lot of people would be killed, the building structure would still be there." And it was. After the impacts, both towers remained standing, showing no major effect on their stability. Furthermore, NIST has confirmed that the initial jet fuel fires themselves lasted at most a few minutes. This means that from that moment on, the only available source of fuel for the fires was common office furnishings. And, as we know, regular office fires are not hot enough to affect the stability of a steel structure.
No steel frame high-rise building has ever collapsed due to fire.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
These kinds of designs have performed extraordinarily well over history. In fact, until this occurrence, no building had fallen down because of fire.
Furthermore, NIST estimated the combustible fuel loading was somewhat lower than found in prior surveys of office spaces. The number of interior walls, and thus the minimal amount of combustible interior finish and limited bookshelf space account for much of the differences. There was no reason for the towers to collapse at that point. With a structure that had clearly withstood the impacts and with less than average office content to feed the fires, both buildings should have remained standing, allowing for the evacuation and rescue of everyone who had survived the initial impacts and the fires. Instead, both buildings suddenly collapsed from top to bottom, one 56 minutes after the impact, the other as much as 1 hour and 42 minutes after the impact of the plane. Why?